I'm going to invite you to turn to Luke chapter 6. And as you're turning there, I want to tell you a story that I think sets this topic of goodness in its proper place. I want to tell you the story this morning of a man named Abijah Powers. Abijah had been a troubled youth and made most of the trouble for himself. And when he had an opportunity to leave home, he took it. And went to the gold fields of the Yukon, in the Klondike, and he joined some of the earliest parties in the hazardous search for gold up there in Alaska. And not as typically succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. So he took his fortune and he went back to his hometown. He checked into the small local inn under an assumed name and hoped that he wouldn't be recognized. In the whole time that he had been away, that he had been a minor, he had not contacted his family members at all. Wasn't sure that he would find his father or mother dead or alive. And he couldn't bear to go back to his childhood home, so instead he thought he would go first to the cemetery to check and see if either of his parents were there. Yes, there were 3 new stones that had been placed in the family's plot. The sight moved him strangely. He bent to read the inscription on the first. It was to the memory of his father and said, "Died 1884. Blessed are those who die in the Lord." And that broke Abijah's heart because that was a year after he had left home. Perhaps his mother had not been left alone long, and so he turned to the second stone and he bent again to read, but this time with tear-filled eyes, "Died 1902. And God shall wipe away every tear from their eyes." His mother had been alone for 18 years. She may have lived in poverty, but certainly in loneliness. There were no other children. And in fact, there were no other family members in the area. He drew himself up to shake it off as if it were a hideous dream. But then he wondered about the third stone. Whose could it be? He bent and looked at the inscription, and it read, "Abijah Powers, born 1870, died blank." The only son of his mother, and she was a widow. You see, it was his own gravestone, set up by his mother in the hope that he would return. The thought was anguish to this graceless son, and it brought him to his knees beside his own empty grave. With his hand resting on his mother's head above the earth, he wept as he had not wept since he were a child. But these were gracious drops out of his mother's love, which had found its cold comfort in the words of Scripture. For the grave that was no grave, there came indeed a resurrection of a real, living soul. The widow's son went out of the graveyard that night a new man. The world wondered what had happened to him. Money did not often make a man from a devil to a saint, but that miracle seemed to have been worked in Abijah Powers. Nobody knew that the transformation did not come from the touch of Klondike gold, but from the power of goodness, reaching beyond the veil, speaking from the cold marble of the gravestone. I want to offer you that moving story this morning because it reminds us that goodness is one of the things that we do a legacy, if we want to be remembered, if we want to have our lives celebrated, we do it by living in hope and in goodness in God's way. So in Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 27, we won't read there, but this context of this is Jesus teaching in the Sermon on the Mount about love for enemies. Go down to verse 32. And Jesus said to them, if you love those who love you, what credit is that? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you can expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. May our hearts be challenged by these words of Jesus Christ, and may we respond with just the kind of goodness to which He is called. Message notes are there in the bulletin if you'd like to use them this morning. The title of this message is To Be Good, Even to the GFN. I'll explain what that means in just a moment, but it's showing us that the fruit of goodness in our lives is intended for all people. Not just the ones that please us, not just the ones who will respond in kind, but it's for all people. Now, God's standard is this: to treat everyone, including the GFN. And that standard is so much better. Here's what GFN stands for: good for nothing. Good for nothing. That's an abbreviation we use around our house, and I think it was born on the day when the dog got after a Kleenex and tore it up, left all the little papers around. And I said, what is that GFN dog doing chewing up Kleenex and leaving it all torn up on the floor? It's an awful mess. And since then, if we have been opining about some situation or something in the house, it's the GFN this or the GFN that. Good for nothing. Now, people aren't really good for nothing, but sometimes in our humanity and in our sinful nature, we think that's so. Let's notice something about this passage. That Jesus used the word sinners a lot. But in your Bible, did you notice it's always with quotation marks? That's because Jesus was using it with irony. Because the Jewish clergy of the day talked about sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, drunkards, people who were the throwaways of society. They were beyond the pale of God's love and beyond the ability of those people to be concerned about them at all. And Jesus came and said, first of all, show them love. Show them love. Now, the complaint about Jesus and the charge that was always leveled against him was that he hung around with those sinners. He spent time with the GFNs. He loved them. And so his message is the opposite of theirs. It's a radical message. And he says, be loving, be good, be generous, be merciful to those who will not return it or don't Do these things without any strings attached, but with a godly motive instead. When we talk about God's love for us, what word do we use to describe it? We use unconditional. That means God didn't say, you have to get your act together before I will love you. You have to perfect yourself. You have to be worthy or deserving in some way. God said, no, in your sinful state, and Paul said, while we were enemies with Christ, God loved us. And God says, do the same. That'd be a pretty tall order if he weren't helping us. Pretty impossible, wouldn't it? He said, secondly, treat them with goodness. And that's our key today. That's what we're focusing on today. Goodness is the fruit of the Spirit that we're lifting up in the month of June. So, we're not asking very much. There's what, 3 more days in June? 3 or 4 more days? Can you be good for the next 3 or 4 days? Unlike the Christmas song, don't be good for goodness' sake. Be good for God's sake. Goodness requires sacrifice. If we're going to do good to others, we have to be willing to sacrifice our time and our convenience. We have to be willing to interrupt our plans and our schedule, because I don't know if you've observed this, but I have. When God brings an opportunity, it wasn't on my calendar. It was on His. So sometimes we have to be flexible enough when opportunity comes to do good, to be good, to say good, to drop what we have planned and do it. We have to get outside of our comfort zone, and we have to be good to people that we might not be comfortable palling around with, people that we wouldn't necessarily invite to dinner. But we get outside of our comfort zone. We have to sacrifice sometimes money and goods as well. We have to sacrifice our prejudice, as the Jewish clergy of that day were unwilling to do. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that goodness is a passive state. It is not. Goodness is an active state, by which I mean don't just wait for opportunities to be good. Go out and create some. Go out and do some good. We talk about random acts of kindness. I think the better thing is intentional acts of kindness. To go out and choose, create your own opportunity to do good. The third thing Jesus said in regards to our enemies, in regards to the sinners, in regards to the GFNs, is to show them generosity. And he's talking here about lending. Now, this kind of generosity is not fiscally sound. In other words, it's not going to net you a return in your capital. Instead, what you're doing is you are investing in heavenly dividends. You understand what I mean? You're investing in eternity. You're giving generously, lending generously, so that God will reward you in heaven. And I'd ask you a moment to consider the difference between a bank and a church in that regard. A bank loans money to people after they've essentially proven that they don't need it. Am I right? Have you been to the bank for a loan, for a mortgage? They want to be sure that you can pay it back. And for the service that they give you, they're going to charge you a little something called interest. You ever tell them I'm not interested? They don't care. But a church gives to meet needs and does not expect it back. And that's the kind of attitude that Jesus wants us to have. To be a church and not a bank. The fourth thing he said, to these who are not going to be loving to you, who are rough people, who are not wonderful, people that have already done you a favor, he says, forgive and forbear. This is in verse 36 at the end of the passage. The reason for being merciful is that we have been shown mercy. And Jesus told a story once of a guy who had $1 billion debt. And when the debt was called, the person to whom he owed it said, you know what, I'm not going to throw you into prison. I'm just going to forgive the debt. Go and be free. And then that same guy whose $1 billion debt had been forgiven found his friend who owed him 20 and threatened to beat him up and put him in jail. And Jesus told that story to illustrate to us we've been forgiven the biggest debt possible, the debt of our sin, and the wages of sin are death. And yet we in our humanity go around and judging each other and condemning each other over trivia. Jesus said, be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. And when we're talking about our enemies who have done us bad, people who have hurt us, to give them kindness in return for their cruelty is to follow the example of Jesus. I don't know about you, but mercy is not my first thought when I've been hurt. But if it's not our first thought, then we need to take time and think again, don't we? We need to consider how mercy is good for them and for us. The second thing that Jesus said is, don't just do this because it's some sort of an intellectual thing, because it's out there in the theology. But he said, realize there's something in it for you to be good. And that is a great reward. A great reward. Look at verse 35. All of these virtues that we've just talked about, love and goodness and generosity and mercy, are all forms of grace. And in verse 35, in the previous verses, Jesus kept saying, what credit is that to you? What's interesting is that in the original language, the word translated here as credit is grace. See, we were thinking of credit card. We were thinking of having a heavenly bank account, and we were putting things in that bank account. But the word here is grace. It's what we didn't deserve. Often when we insist on justice or fairness, we're looking for ourselves. But that's backwards to God's economy. God is going to make justice happen, but it might not be in my timing or in the way I prefer. Peter wrote a letter, and in it he talked about credit in the same way. That we but we receive God's grace when we endure suffering. So what kind of a reward are we talking about? Well, the first thing that Jesus wants us to know about this great reward is that it's not earthly. In other words, don't expect it to come back in the form of cash, stocks, bonds, cars, larger garage, more stuff. Because in verse 35, Jesus said, love, do good, lend, show mercy, without expecting anything back. I think when Jesus said anything, he meant everything. Don't expect anything back. No conditions. Not even a recognition. Not even gratitude. Nothing back. Some of the GFN folk that we're going to love won't even be polite. Say nothing of great hands. Okay. Then it's a heavenly reward. So what should be our motive for doing good? Well, first of all, our motive should be God said so. And the Word of God tells us that His commands are always a delight, that they make us happy. Doing good makes you happy. The second reason is back in verse 31. If you'll look there, you'll find what we call the golden rule. Do to others what? You have them do to you. You know, that is so simple and so profound. If we would carry that with us on a day-to-day basis and think, what trying to do is to pair my resource with someone else's need. That's where generosity and goodness and love and mercy come together. My resource, someone else's need. And then the fourth is what Jesus promises here, a heavenly reward. That's what the word great means. It's heavenly. And interestingly, the Greek word for reward is the wage that's given to a worker. So when God rewards us in heaven, folks, it's not going to be with salvation. That's an entirely different thing. But when we go to heaven, because we're saved, God is going to reward us for the things that we've done here on earth that are good and pleasing to Him. And that can be part of your motive for doing good. I want to build up that heavenly account. We talk about putting stars in your crown. That's what that language is about. One of the rewards is that we become children of the Most High, sons and daughters of God. We are adopted into the family of God. And folks, every family comes with a name. And every name comes and brings with it a heritage, a legacy. And part of what should motivate us to do good is that we carry the name of God. And we don't want to bring dishonor to that name. We need to recognize that it's part of the character of our family to be like Jesus, to be good. And then also in proportion to your sacrifice. There were several people coming to the temple one day, and Jesus observed the offerings as they were being given, and he saw a widow lady come in with 2 pennies, 2 coins that were of the smallest possible value in their economy. She put those in the offering box. And Jesus said that because that was all her means, that the proportion of her sacrifice was greater. And thereby the proportion of her reward. And let's notice finally that we are rewarded for being like God. We're rewarded for being like God. And notice what Jesus says about God in verse 35. He is kind to the ungrateful. God is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Those GFNs and associates. I think the biggest impediment to goodness is trying to be good on our own. The Word of God testifies that all of our goodness is never good enough, and we need the goodness of God. So what I'm asking you this morning is to seek and to be open to opportunities for God to do something in your life that you clearly couldn't do on your own. Things that you wouldn't have thought of on your own, resources that you might not have used had it been entirely up to you. And when you do something, friends, that only God can do, then only God gets the glory. Amen? Only God, and that's the kind of thing that will make the difference. In his commentary on this passage, and I'm going to close with this, Darrell L. Bach wrote the following. The call of the disciple is to a greater love, a distinct love, a love that is unique in the world. We want to make a difference in our culture. We want to have a voice in our society. We want to redeem, and we want to improve, and we want to bring people to Jesus. Where do we start? With this kind of character. worship service today by surrendering to God all that might stand in his way, even our own goodness, even our own pride, surrendering it all so that we can follow him. Would you take a songbook, please? And we'll turn to